Professor Noam Chomsky is listed in anybody's catalog as among the half-dozen top heroes of the New Left. This standing he achieved by adopting over the past 2 or 3 years a series of adamant positions projecting at least American foreign policy, at most America itself. His essays and speeches are collected in his new book, American Power and the New Mandarins. Usually, Mr. Chomsky writes non-political books, for instance, Syntactic Structures in 1957, Cartesian Linguistics in 1966, and Topics in the Theory of Generative Grammar, 1965. He is a highly esteemed student of modern language and linguistics who teaches nowadays at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has taught before at Berkeley, Columbia, and other strife-torn universities. He is a member of many organizations and learned societies, including, I'm sure he would want me to mention, the Aristotelian Society of Great Britain. In one of his essays, Mr. Chomsky writes, quote, "By accepting the presumption of legitimacy of debate on certain issues such as this one has already lost one's humanity." I should like to begin by asking him why, under the circumstances, if by being here he stands to lose his humanity, he consented to appear in the first place.
Because, first of all, I didn't quite put it in those terms, I don't think. I think that by... Yeah, but I think that I said that there are certain issues, for example, Auschwitz, such that by consenting to discuss them, one degrades oneself and to some degree loses one's humanity, and I think that that's true. Nevertheless, I can easily imagine circumstances in which I would have been glad to debate Auschwitz. For example, if there were some chance that by debating Auschwitz it might have been possible to eliminate it or to at least mitigate the horror of what was going on. And I feel the same way about Vietnam. And I really think that fundamentally there is no argument anymore at an intellectual level, in my opinion. But I think it's very important to discuss it nevertheless.
At what level is there an argument?
Well, there is a policy which I think is a destructive and devastating policy. It's continuing, and the continuation of the policy is to some extent based on the fact of public apathy or public acceptance. Hence, there still is the necessity to convince people that they should act strongly to put an end to this policy.
At what point was there an intellectual argument? At which point did an intellectual argument in favor of our intervening in Vietnam cease to exist?
Well, as I say there, I think that there may have been a time when there was something to debate. For example, I think that in the middle 50s, though I was opposed to the policy, and I think that it was right to be opposed to it, nevertheless, I think it was a debatable issue in a sense in which it is no longer a debatable issue.
Why is that?
Because at the moment I think it's really an issue of the survival of the existence of Vietnam as an entity, as a social and cultural entity. I think that's what's at stake.
But even that could be intellectually argued, couldn't it?
Well, in the same sense in which Auschwitz could be intellectually argued.
No, I mean in a different sense.
No, I think in the same sense. In fact, don't forget there were people who argued in favor of Auschwitz and gave...
No, I haven't gotten that at all. I hadn't had any such on this program, nor do I intend to. But it seems to me that even if what you said were correct, there could be a perfectly legitimate argument over, for instance, the continuation of the state of Anguilla, or the continuation of the state of Biafra, or the continuation of the state of Goa.
I didn't talk about the existence of the state. I talked about the existence of the society as a social and cultural entity. I think that's what's at stake.
Oh, okay. Well, what, if it's at stake, mightn't there be 2 points of view about how to help it evolve into its natural forms, right?
Oh, there are many different points of view. I think they're very legitimate.
Well, now, how can you say
they're very legitimate? They're very legitimate issues that can be argued as to how the United States ought to most efficaciously put an end to its destructive actions in Vietnam. There are many different alternatives that might be thought about.
Yes, but one way, of course, to put an end to America's necessary intervention is to conclude the war successfully. That's a way,
Yeah,
right?
one possible way is by destroying Vietnam, which I think is probably the most likely outcome.
Yeah. Well, now, for instance, one way in which we put an end to the Nazi occupation of France was by destroying Nazi Germany, correct?
That's right.
And it seems to me that this was a position which is a tenable position, and mutatis mutandis, it's a terrible position
No,
today,
because mutatis mutandis
well, explain to
changes
me
everything
why.
in this
Explain
case.
to me why.
Because in this case...
as you know, it's not only I,
Yeah.
but people with whom I disagree, like
Yes,
Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., who refers to your theological certitudes
Yeah.
and your liberal application of them to every subject in which you touch. So the subject of your own intolerance of other people's point of view is, I think, itself linguistically interesting.
Well, first of all, I don't accept that criticism. You see, if you look at that quotation, you'll notice that I put it in there, and recall the context. I said that when I argue the issue, I feel a tone of moral and emotional falseness, which I want to explain, but then I go ahead to argue the issue. So that's a side remark intended to explain my own feeling of emotional and moral falseness, which is real. I do feel it. But nevertheless, I then go ahead for 300 pages or so to discuss this and related issues.
Yeah, but
so I don't really believe that it's fair to say that I'm not willing to tolerate other positions.
Yeah, the trouble is you don't end the book by saying, I'm kind of odd in feeling this. You say, everybody is odd who doesn't agree with me, right?
No, I don't think so. Do I say that?
This is certainly the burden of your book.
I wasn't aware of that. Yeah. I mean, I think that I've given, an argument.
Well, maybe this is a universal difficulty you're having, not being aware of certain people's reading of your position.
Well, then let me say, I think for example, I think I take a very qualified and temperate position on many, many issues in this book. For example, take the issue of the background of the Second World War, which I spent a lot of time on. If you notice, I end up with a statement saying that I don't see any way to give a clear, sharp resolution, clear, sharp answer to the question what we should have done under such and such circumstances. I discussed someone who did take a very strong and I think very honorable position, namely A.J. Muste, and I say that I wish I could answer the question for myself whether I feel that I would have taken or would have rejected that position, but I don't see any way to do it because the issue is mixed. And on many issues, I feel that way. On the other hand, see, when the issue is when the issue is, let's say, 3 million tons of bombs dropped on Vietnam, I don't feel that way anymore. Nevertheless, I'm still perfectly willing to argue the issue, calmly, quietly, and then...
As you would have saved the dropping of the bombs in Dresden.
Exactly, or the atom bomb, let's say. See, I would have been willing to argue the dropping the atom bomb, though I do feel that it's a war crime.
Sure, but I do think that you put some people at a disadvantage by your a priori assertion that any position that disagrees with your own is intellectually barren.
Well, I didn't mean that, really. Let me explain. Maybe it didn't come across, but what I meant was something else. I wanted to honestly state my own emotional and my own feeling about entering into a debate over this issue.
Sort of Portnoy-wise?
No, I think that the point is that I think it's only fair to an audience of readers to say this is the way I approach the issue, and you read me on the basis of this understanding the best I can give as to the way I'm approaching this issue. And it's perfectly true that when I do, if you notice what I say is that increasingly over the years in discussing this issue, I felt this feeling of emotional and moral falseness. And I think it would only be honest to express it.
Sure.
Then to go ahead with the discussion.
Oh, quite so. But you also say that you hate yourself for not having come to that position earlier.
Yeah, I do. I think that was a very great mistake.
Well, I hope to give you a little solace. Because the reason I do raise this, and I rejoice in your disposition to argue the Vietnam question, especially when I recognize what an act of self-control this must involve.
It does.
Sure.
It really does. I mean, I think that this is the kind of issue where sometimes I lose my temper. Maybe not tonight.
Maybe not tonight. Because if you would, I'd smash you in the goddamn face. You say in your book...
Good reason for not losing my temper.
You say the war is simply an obscenity, a depraved act by weak and miserable men.
Including all of us. Including myself,
well,
including that's the next sentence, same sentence.
Sure, because you count everybody in the company of the guilty.
I think that's true in this case.
Yeah, but
see, one of the points I was
trying... This is a sense of theological observation, isn't it?
No, I don't think so.
Because as somebody points out, if everybody's guilty of everything, then nobody's guilty of anything.
No, I don't. Well, no, I don't believe that. See, I think the point that I'm trying to make, and I think ought to be made, is that the real, at least to me, I say this elsewhere in the book, what seems to me a very, in a sense, terrifying aspect of our society and other societies is the equanimity and the detachment with which sane, reasonable, sensible people can observe such events. I think that's more terrifying than the occasional Hitler or LeMay or other that crops up. These people would not be able to operate were it not for this apathy and equanimity. And therefore I think that it's, in some sense, the sane and reasonable and tolerant people who should who share a very serious burden of guilt that they very easily throw on the shoulders of others who seem more extreme and more violent.
No, I agree, but surely the emotional temperature of yourself or of myself or of other people is not in and of itself an index, an automatic index to the righteousness of our emotions.
Certainly not.
As
I
we
wouldn't
know,
mean
for
it to be
instance,
intended.
people were approximately equally wrought up in the late 30s over whether or not America should help the Western powers to defend themselves against the Axis powers. And I think it is incorrect to suppose that people of either side were necessarily right simply because they were exercised.
Oh, I'd agree with that totally.
Yeah.
There's no connection whatsoever
No
between
connection whatsoever,
you know,
yeah.
degree of emotion and degree of correctness.
But as you understand the existing situation, it ought to be, in your judgment, a transparently evil thing that we are engaged in, and you are derivatively concerned because there isn't, because there is not a shared sense of indignation, like
right.
your own.
Now, I don't say that I am right because I am indignant. Rather, I say that I think in this case I am right to be indignant, which is different. I have to prove that.
You are right to be indignant if you are right.
That's right, and that has to be demonstrated. That's why
That
I
has to
have
be demonstrated, which
you
is
know,
why we're
dozens
here.
of pages of argument about
Sure.
it, which may or may not convince people. Convinces
Sure.
me. Yeah.
Sure.
But I agree.
Well, let me then, excuse me, did I interrupt you? I'm
No,
sorry.
go ahead.
Let me ask you this. If, in fact, your concern is to communicate your moral concern, to what extent have you spent a time thinking about your techniques? Now, I say this seriously because it is probably true that under certain circumstances, the communication of one's own indignation and fury and restraint is best communicated emotionally, i.e. to one's own satisfaction, by screaming and yelling.
Right.
But if it becomes observable that this doesn't bring people around, then you've got to consider the problem of communication, which it becomes a moral problem, just as you would consent to argue Auschwitz or Buchenwald with somebody if there was a chance of dissipating something of the sort. Now, if you have given that problem any thought, how come that you end up saying, as you do in your book, that Senator Mike Mansfield is, quote, the kind of man who is the terror of our age?
Well, let me put that in its context as well. What
Yeah.
I say is, I believe that, and what I say is that Senator Mansfield is an American intellectual in the best sense, a sane, reasonable, scholarly man, the kind of man who is the terror of our age. And that's essentially what I was saying before. I think that the terror of our age is the
mass man.
The sane, responsible, serious, quiet man who watches these things unfold and doesn't react to them. I include myself in that, as I tried to make clear in the earlier statements.
Well, if, put it this way, your counsel is surely a counsel of despair if, on the one hand, you accost us with your own relative moral superiority and yet end up despising yourself, appealing to scrupulosity for your own shortcomings. I mean, this makes things pretty...
Not really. For one thing, I don't feel any relative moral superiority, and I tried, maybe failed, but I tried very hard to express that in the book. That I said somewhere in the beginning that if there is any tone of self-righteousness or anything like that, it's unintended and certainly undeserved, and I mean that very much. See, I mean, after all, given the feelings that I have, which I've just expressed, you know, and which you perceive, I should be doing really strong things, which I don't think I am doing. So there's no sense of moral superiority, and I'm not interested in simply, you know, throwing blame around or giving people marks. I think that the beginning of wisdom in this case is to recognize something about what we stand for in the world, what we're doing in the world. And I think when we do recognize that, we will feel an enormous sense of guilt. And I say somewhere in there that one should be very careful not to let confessions of guilt overcome the possibility of action. I say that confessions of guilt can be very good therapy, as they can, as is well known. They're also very good preventative to action. And I think one should be very wary of that. In fact, if I remember...
Well, I think we should.
I have some remarks
I think
about
that your formulation of it is at least saintly, but it still is a dislocating, at least, to people who fancy themselves as spending an equal amount of time attempting to refine their whole apparatus of moral discrimination and who come up with conclusions directly at variance with your own. Now, the reason I haven't asked you